Chapter 28, Jacob was at Bethel, and Bethel is a Hebrew word. It's Beit El, which is the house of God. Jacob calls the place Bethel and erects a stone there because he sees the angels ascending and descending on the earth, and he says, surely God is in this place. And so Jacob sees that, he calls it Bethel, and if you remember at the end of chapter 28, Jacob tells God, God, you have to do these 5 things for me, and then I will adopt you as my God. You do these 5 things, and then you will be my God. And I'll give you 1/10 of everything that I have, which I always find humorous. You know, God, here's your checklist, and then I'm only going to give you a small portion of what I have. And that's going to be very important for our study today. Now, chapter 29 picks up with Jacob coming to the land of his uncle Laban. Laban is the brother of Rebekah. You remember when Eleazar goes to Abraham's family to pick a wife for Isaac, he picks Rebekah. Rebekah is the sister of Laban. Laban is the one to whom the dowry is paid and all of that. Well, this is the same Laban. So Jacob is going to his uncle's household. When he gets to this area, he approaches it and sees some shepherds who are about to water their flock. It's the hottest part of the day. They're gathered at a well, and the well is covered by a stone. Now, that's very important. And so Jacob comes up and he asks these shepherds, why aren't you watering your flock? It's the hottest part of the day. It would only make sense to take care of your animals by giving them water. And the shepherds say, we're not going to water the flock until everybody gets here. That way we can have help rolling this stone because the stone's so heavy, and we can just do it all at once instead of having to do it time and time again. Makes sense. Well, right as soon as they finish saying that, here comes Rachel. Now, Rachel is the daughter of Laban. So Rachel would be Jacob's cousin. And here comes Rachel, and Rachel is drop-dead gorgeous. It's love at first sight. Jacob is just smitten with Rachel. Now, why is Rachel coming out? Because she's shepherding the flock. She's driving the herd. Now, I don't know how much you know about ancient agriculture, but women do not typically do that. Men are to be the shepherd. Shepherding is a lowly job in the ancient Near East. It's a very humble job. People didn't really want to do that job. So Rachel comes out. She is the daughter of this sheik of a man. You know, he's someone who's respected in the community, but she comes out with the sheep to make sure the sheep are watered. Now, what we will see in later chapters, I think this is chapter 32, is that when Jacob decides that it's time to go back home and leave Laban, Leah and Rachel, Leah is Rachel's sister, Leah and Rachel say, well, let's just up and leave and not tell Daddy where we're going because he's treated us like slaves our whole life. Well, we need to think about this passage when we read that, because the fact that Laban is making Rachel herd sheep is a very demeaning and lowly thing. It's a very insulting thing. But here she comes and Jacob's just smitten with her. And I love what the text tells us here. Jacob transforms from being the tent dweller to the macho man, because there's this stone that's over the well. And it's going to take a lot of people to move this stone. And the Bible says that Jacob grabbed that stone and threw it off by himself. What's he doing? He's showing out for Rachel, flexing them guns. You know, he wants to show her how strong and wonderful he is, and I just find humor in the Bible, and I find that to be a little humorous because all of us gentlemen can remember times where we might have done something like that to impress some ladies. But what we find here, in all seriousness, is a transformation of character. That's what these chapters are going to show. It's a transformation of character of Jacob. So then we're introduced to Rachel and Leah. We've already met Rachel. Leah is Rachel's older sister. Leah is described as someone who has, my Bible translates it, tender eyes. Now, your Bible, you can look at 100 Bibles and it'll have 100 different translations. You ask me, what does this mean? We don't know. But I'm going to tell you my opinion, and you can take it or leave it. Rachel is depicted very clearly as being incredibly physically beautiful. I find that Rachel is depicted as sort of the captain of the cheerleading squad. She's the popular girl. She's the pretty girl. She's the girl that everybody wants to be around. She's the center of attention. That doesn't necessarily mean that she's, anything bad about that. That's just the way I think the text presents her. She's kind of the captain of the cheerleading squad. Leah, on the other hand, if you read commentaries, one of them will say that she was she was quiet and reserved and introverted kind of person, and maybe that's true. Others will say that she just, wasn't very physically attractive. Some will just flat call her ugly, which I think is reading way too much into the text, because the text doesn't say that. I view Leah as more of the type of girl that enjoyed home ec. So you've got the captain of the cheerleading squad, and then you've got the home ec girl. She's a homely kind of person. Someone who has tender eyes. She's not into the makeup and dresses, She just wants to kind of be and do. And so however we read of this, I think what the text really is telling us is it's putting Rachel and Leah in sort of polar opposites in the same way it does Jacob and Esau. Esau's a man of the field. He's a brute. Jacob is a man of the tents. He's more kind of cunning and smart and conniving in some ways. Rachel is sort of the outgoing popular, and Leah's the introverted homegirl. And that just seems to be the way it is. Now, as we're introduced to them, Jacob, as we've said, falls madly in love with Rachel and wants to marry her. And so he asks Laban, I want to marry her. But remember, when Jacob left his father's house, he has absolutely nothing. One reason why one of the requirements for God in chapter 28 is that God has to provide him food and clothing. Well, why is that? It's because he has absolutely nothing. So he has nothing to pay a dowry. Now, in the ancient world, if you wanted to get married, you had to pay a dowry. And that dowry could be in the form of livestock, it could be in the form of jewels, it could be in the form of money, it could be in the form of all kinds of different things, but Jacob doesn't have anything. And so Jacob strikes up a deal with Laban that says, I'll work 7 years and then I'll get to marry Rachel. That's my dowry. So Jacob goes to work, he works 7 years, and it comes time for the wedding. In the ancient world, much like today, the brides would wear veils that covered their face. And you would not know who that person was until the next day. And so Jacob goes, he does the wedding ceremony. Weddings in this time lasted a week. And so they celebrate the wedding. They have the wedding night. Jacob wakes up the next day, and my Bible translates it kind of humorously. He says, and behold, it was Leah, exclamation point. Now, he expected it to be Rachel, but it wasn't. It was Leah. Now, maybe we can sympathize with Jacob here. It's one thing to be cheated. It's another thing to be just flat connived. And there's no real good reason for this. Jacob confronts Laban about it. And Laban says, look, dude, it's not our custom. The custom in our land is the oldest has to be married first. So you really could never have had Rachel. But I tell you what, you can work another 7 years and pay her dowry, and then you can marry Rachel, to which Jacob does. But I think this is a really important theological point for us, that what Laban does is he lets culture define his morality. He says, it's not our custom. I'm bound by the terms of culture. And what I see in the church today, and maybe you see it too, is that we are letting culture define our morality. We are moving away from Scripture and God defining our morality, and we're saying, first of all, is it legal? And people believe that if something's legal, then therefore it's moral. I'm here to tell you there's a lot of things that are legal that aren't moral. And there are a lot of things that in many places are illegal that are moral. So when we let culture define our morality, we're messing up. But that's what Laban does. So Jacob works 7 more years for Rachel. And then the text ends in chapter 29, in chapter 29 and verse 30, by saying that Jacob loved Rachel more than Leah. In biblical studies, there are a number of different lenses through which you read the Bible, and people kind of develop their scholarship and their studies out of the lenses that you study the Bible. And one that has become very popular over the past, I'll say, 50 years, but really over the past 20 years, is what's called feminist criticism. And it's basically, it sounds a lot worse than, because feminism and feminist has a negative tones in conservative circles, but it's basically reading the text from the point of view of the woman in the text rather than the man in the text. And I find that really helpful when we read the accounts of Rachel and Leah and Jacob, and reading the text from Leah's point of view. And I hope to highlight that here in just a moment, but it's maybe we can sympathize with Leah. You know, it's one thing to be married to someone and have difficulty. It's another thing to be married to someone who does not love you and who point blank does not love you. Now, was Jacob a good husband to Leah? In some senses, yes. In some senses, no. But maybe we can sympathize with Leah. So let's look at Leah here. Well, I thought we would. Randall, can you click to the next slide? Okay, while he's working on that, maybe let's just look in our Bibles. And at the end of chapter 29, beginning of chapter 30, we have the kids being born to these wives. There are 4 wives of Jacob. We typically only talk about 2, but there are 4. Zilpah and Bilhah are the other 2, and they are the handmaids that are given to Rachel and Leah when they're married. The reason we say that they are wives, first of all, the text says that Jacob took them as wives, but the reason that he does that is because there come times, both for Leah and Rachel, when they can't bear children, and it's important to have that lineage continue on, and so Bilhah and Zilpah are sort of surrogates for Rachel and Leah. So, we got it up now? Yep, thank you. Okay, so here are the children as they're given to all 4. We'll start from this end and work our way back. Bilhah is the mother of Dan and Naphtali. I know in the South we say Naphtali, but that's not how you pronounce it. It's Naphtali. And then Rachel has Joseph, and we don't meet Benjamin until chapter 35, but I went ahead and put him up here just for reference. Zilpah has Gad and Asher. Now notice how many of the male children are from Leah. 6 out of the 12. 6 out of the 12. There's also a daughter, Dinah, who we'll meet in chapter 35 as well. But 6 out of the 12 come from the line of the unloved. Of those 6, 2 really jump out to me. One is Levi, because Levi is the line through whom the priest will come. Levi is the line through whom Moses and Aaron will come. Levi is the line through whom those who serve in the temple and serve as the middleman between man and God will come, and they come through the line of the unloved. The other is Judah. Judah is the line of kings. Judah is the line through whom David will come and through whom Solomon will come. It's the line through whom our Lord and Savior will come as the Lion of Judah. And he came through the line of the unloved. If you go to Matthew's Gospel and read the genealogy of that's listed there in chapter 1 of Matthew, which we typically do around this time of year with Christmas and so forth, pay attention to Matthew's genealogy. There's 4 women that are listed in the genealogy. 4. All 4 are Gentiles. All 4 are Gentiles. It's amazing to me to look at who God uses. That God rarely, He will, in many instances, use those who are the powerful and the mighty. But more times than not, God uses those who are minute, small, insignificant. And here, the unloved. So that brings us then to the second part of chapter 30. All right, I guess Randall's gone. Well, never mind. We'll just stick to the Bible then. Oh, there he is. Hi, Randall. I don't know what's up with my clicker, but it ain't clicking. We got new toys in the booth, and we're trying to figure out how to work them. I think I might have messed him up worse than anything. But let's just continue on to chapter 31, and we'll just look at our text. In chapter 31, Jacob has been with Laban now for 15 or so years. He works 14 for his 2 wives and has now at least had time to grow his family. And as he grows in his family, he's now decided that it's time to go back home. Now remember, one of the requirements in chapter 28 for God is that God has to bring Jacob back to his father's house. So now he thinks it's time to go back home. And as he does that, he starts by saying that he wants to go home, but he wants some possessions. He wants something to take with him. And Laban doesn't want him to go home. So what we find in chapter 30, I was on the wrong page. I was on chapter 31. That's what confused me. Chapter 30 is that when Jacob says that Laban wants to go home, Laban, it gives us the text gives us a description of Laban as an idol worshiper and someone who deals with divination. Now, here's the interesting thing about that. If you read verse 27 of chapter 30, it only talks about consulting divination. It says, Laban said to him, "If I have found favor in your sight, please stay here, for I have learned by divination that the Lord has blessed me on account of you." Well, it says nothing there about idols, so why do I include idols here? Well, first of all, you keep reading, Rachel is going to steal household idols when they leave, but we haven't gotten there yet. But divination is something that is completely prohibited in the entire Old Testament, right, in the law of Moses. You can't do that. So, divination is where you consult of the gods. You don't read this in the English text, but if you read it in the original language, this is something that Laban did habitually. He would seek after divination on a regular basis. And so, what does that mean? Well, Laban would probably get up in the morning on the beginning of a week, or maybe he did it every day. He'd go down to this prophet, this diviner of sorts. The diviner would read animal bones and entrails and basically kind of tell him his future. Now, we sit here and we're like, wow, that's really weird. You know what? We have people today who get on their phone every morning and read their horoscope. It's the same stupid stuff. I'll just call it what it is. It's absolutely stupid to say that a star is going to tell you your future. Get out of here. Now, this is the first time that we read something about Laban that separates him tangibly from the people of Abraham. The people of Abraham don't do this, right? The people of Isaac don't do that. They don't practice that way. Yahweh is their God. They don't consult of the gods. But Jacob hasn't adopted God as his God quite yet. Okay, so Laban now is this diviner, this idol worshiper, and we start getting characters of Laban. Next point, please, Randall, if you can. Check my notes. Okay, thank you. Now, as Jacob decides to leave and they're working out this deal, Laban realizes that while Jacob has been with Laban, Laban has been really blessed. Laban has grown, he's made money, everything's gone well for him, and he understands because of the divination that the reason this has happened is because Yahweh, God, is with Jacob. And so the only reason Laban's having any good luck is because Jacob is with him. So the last thing Laban wants, because Laban is a greedy money grabber, the last thing Laban wants is for Jacob to go away. And so they work out a deal. Laban says, all right, you can go, but before you go, let's have you kind of start your own stuff, and you get taken care of, you get established, and then you can go. So they work out this deal where Jacob is going to take all of the sheep and the goats that have spot or stripe or mixed colors or whatever, and that Laban's going to keep the pure and the white ones. Now, let's think about this. Y'all know I work goat sales, and we're in the sheep business, me and Dad and we do this. And I have sold a spotted goat, or been at a sale with a friend who was the auctioneer, but worked a sale for a spotted goat that brought $45,000. So what's the difference between a spotted goat and a solid white goat? Or a spotted goat or a spotted sheep and a solid white sheep? In the ancient world, the solid white ones were more valuable because you could dye their wool. You could dye it any color, right? And so that's what people wanted. So what Jacob is doing here is he's taking the less desirable, and he's going to be blessed by taking the less desirable. We get this weird comments in the text about Jacob taking these branches or these sticks and stripping the bark off of them where the white of the branch is exposed and setting them up around watering areas so that when the sheep and goats mate in front of those poles, they'll have multicolored offspring. Now that sounds like a very paganistic ritual, doesn't it? I mean, the Bible has a lot of fertility myths in it, especially in the prophets. You know, you read Jeremiah in particular, there's warnings against the Asherah poles. Asherah was the goddess of fertility, and the poles were put up to look like what you might think a pole would look like, and you were to take a temple prostitute down there and engage in sexual intercourse with her, and that was a form of worship. Right? And that was what the Israelites were doing. And so these fertility myths span all over the Old Testament, they really, and even into the New Testament as well, with places like Ephesus and other places. So what is Jacob doing? Is he doing a pagan practice? I don't think so. If he is, he still gives credit to God, which I find very interesting. So even if he is dealing with pagan cult practice, he attributes the blessing to God. Now, he's not quite adopted God as his God yet. But maybe all we can say about this is that it was cultural for them, and maybe that's something cultural that we just kind of have to give an aside to. Don't want to make a mountain out of a molehill there. Okay, chapter 31. Now, Jacob wanted to go home in chapter 30. Chapter 31 is where he actually does. Chapter 31, he says, all right, kids and wives, let's pack up and go. Chapter 31 begins rather interestingly. Let's read the first two verses here. It says, Jacob heard that Laban's sons were complaining, Jacob has taken everything that belonged to our father. He's gotten rich at our father's expense. And when Jacob saw the look on Laban's face, he could tell his attitude toward him had changed. Well, Laban never expected that Jacob would actually grow from having the less desired. But he did. And he became more profitable and more prosperous than Laban. And so the attitude had changed. Now, maybe we've encountered people like this before where you start doing something and people say, man, we're rooting for you. We want you to succeed. We're proud of you. And then you start succeeding and then people say, well, you're just not the same. You're not who you were. We see this a lot in the music industry. Like the top musical artist right now, and you may have never listened to one of her songs before, but you know who she is. Taylor Swift is the top singer in the industry today, hands down. She is. And I hear a lot of people say, when she first broke out, they really enjoyed her country music. Like, man, we love this Taylor Swift girl. She's going to be great in country music. Then she left country and went into pop, and people are like, oh, she's changed. You know, I just can't stand to listen to her anymore. Like, well, that's the attitude that Laban and his sons have toward Jacob. When Jacob first came, he was like, hey, buddy, we're here for you. We're rooting for you. We want you to be blessed and prosper. And then he actually does, and they're like, oh, he's just taking everything. This shouldn't have happened. And that really tends to happen a lot with our attitudes. Maybe we need to check on our attitudes. So, obviously, Jacob wanted to leave for quite a while. Jacob spends 20 years with Laban, 14 of which he's working for 2 wives, but 20 years. And so he's been at a point where he wanted to leave. How much time is between chapter 30 and chapter 31? I don't know. Probably 5 or 6 years. So he's wanted to leave for quite some time, but now the time is actually right. Maybe that's something else we need to remember, that sometimes we want to act when the time is not right. So when do you know that the time is right? Well, look at what Jacob did. Jacob knows the time is right, number one, because Jacob has grown. He's grown as a person. He's grown intellectually. He's become a husband and a father. And I'll tell you, at least one half of that will help you grow. And I've heard from others who have done the other half that the other half will help you grow or make you grow. He's grown as a leader. He's grown in his prosperity. But maybe more than that, God comes to Jacob and tells him, now is the time. Now's the time for you to get up and go. I want you to notice what God says to him in verse 13. God comes to Jacob and says, I am the God of what? Verse 13 of chapter 31, I'm the God of Bethel. Bethel was where Jacob saw the angels ascending and descending and had that conversation with God, and where he made that bargain with God. If you do these 5 things, then you'll be my God, and I'll give you a 10th. Well, God says, look here, I'm the God of Bethel. He says, where you anointed the sacred stone made a vow to me. Now leave this land immediately and return to your native land. The last requirement that God had to keep for Jacob to adopt God as his God and to give him a tenth was, you have to bring me back to my father's house. And God's keeping good on that promise. He's going to do it. So Jacob has grown as a person, and God is now with him. These 5 things, as we said in verse 13, we already talked about that. I just didn't advance the slide enough, so sorry for that. Let's move on to continue with chapter 31. As we continue in chapter 31, Jacob decides to leave, and what's interesting about this is, Jacob doesn't seek after a blessing from Laban, which is traditionally what you would do. If you're going to start a venture, you want to be blessed by the head of the house in some sense. And so we would expect that Jacob would go in and tell Laban, I'm going back to my father's house. Thank you for everything you've done for me. Thank you for feeding me and clothing me and providing with this livestock. And I wouldn't have what I have without you. Now, I know that God is obviously behind this, and Laban is sort of depicted in a very negative light in Scripture. But that's what we would expect Jacob to do, and then Laban would bless him and he would go on his way. The interesting thing about this is that Jacob and Rachel and Leah all leave without ever talking to Laban. And as we mentioned at the very beginning with Rachel and Leah, they kind of have a conference call among themselves and say, yeah, we just need to up and leave. Daddy has treated us horribly our entire lives. He's treated us like slaves, the text says, and we might think back to Rachel being with the sheep. That's a slave's job, and that's what she had to do. So Laban here is depicted again. We saw a glimpse of this in chapter 30. We see it much more vibrant in chapter 31. He is depicted in a sense of otherness. So remember, when Jacob left from Rebekah and Isaac, all those chapters ago, Rebekah says, go back to my family. So there's association there, right? It's my family. And the text up until now has depicted Laban, Rachel, Leah, and everybody as Jacob's family. But the text changes in chapter 31. First of all, we find that Laban has household idols. We might expect that from chapter 30, being someone who seeks of divination. But Rachel goes in and steals the household idols. Now, I know that in our vacation Bible school kind of mindsets, we like to put Rachel on a pedestal. And the Bible, the Old Testament in particular, does put Rachel on somewhat of a pedestal. She's the line through whom Joseph is going to come, and you have the Joseph narrative that leads into Exodus chapter 1, of course. And in Jeremiah, we talk about Rachel weeping over her children as a poetic way to talk about how Israel and Judah have gone away and left the Lord. And so Rachel has a prominent place in the Hebrew Bible. But Rachel really isn't the heroine that we might think her to be. She steals the household idols. Why is that? Well, one, it might be a slight against her dad, because I think Rachel had some daddy issues. But second, it's also because she doesn't believe they're going to make it out alive. And she wants a little extra help. So she steals the household idols that come from Laban. They don't tell Laban that they're leaving, which I find absolutely hilarious, because remember, Laban is someone who does divination on an ongoing basis. Shouldn't they have known? Shouldn't there have been like some spot on a liver of some animal to say, hey, your kids are going to leave? It reminds me of that show. There was a talk show years ago, like when I was a little kid, and I don't even remember what talk show it was. It came on like at 11 o'clock in the morning on weekdays, and there was a psychic on the talk show, and I remember, the only reason I know about this is because it blew up, and everybody's talked about it since. Y'all probably know what it is once I say it, but there was a psychic that was featured on the talk show, and the psychic was doing crowd work and saying, I'm getting a voice, you had a great-great-grandmother that died. Well, obviously, everybody has a great-great-grandmother that died, and so this psychic said, I feel a strong connection to you. I think we need to continue talking about this. What's your phone number? And the audience member said, well, you're the psychic, you should know. Right? Well, that's kind of how I view Laban here. Laban's surprised that they left, but he's someone who practices divination. He should have known. Right? So that just shows the idolatry of Laban. He's also now for the first time called an Aramean. He's Laban the Aramean. He's not the Laban associated with Jacob. He's not the Laban associated with Israel. He's not the Laban even associated with Rebekah or Abraham. He's Laban the Aramean. So now we're getting this barrier. We're getting this sense of otherness that separates Jacob and his family as their own unit. Okay? that brings us then to what I like to call the theology of barriers. Barriers are important. We have to remember who's reading this text originally. Who are the first readers of Genesis? Well, probably the people along the Exodus, right? If we take Mosaic authorship, and I think there's strong reasons for that. Then Moses is writing this for the people who are traveling out of Egypt to the land of Canaan. They're going to a land that is going to be defined by barriers. So what you read in Genesis chapter 12, I believe it is, God tells Abraham, this is the land that you're going to, and these are the barriers. Then you go to Joshua and Judges, and the barriers in Joshua and Judges don't match exactly the barriers in Genesis. And it seems to me that the barriers in Genesis are more of an idealistic barrier, and the barriers in Joshua and Judges are the finite barriers that actually are. There's no contradiction there. It's just is how it is. But the Hebrews and Israel even today, the main issue with Israel today, with the terrorist attacks and all that's happening in Israel and Palestine, is over what? It's over barriers and borders and whose land is whose. So barriers are a defining feature of a culture. And now, maybe we might transition and talk from barriers to borders. Borders also serve to protect. Now, this is important. So as Jacob leaves, he leaves without telling. Laban and his sons and his people find out about this, and they catch up. And when they catch up, God tells Laban, do not bless him and do not curse him. Now that's interesting. Why would we not want, because the Abrahamic covenant, God says, I will bless those who bless you and I'll curse those who curse you. So we might expect that God would want Laban to bless Jacob. But here's the problem. If Laban blesses Jacob, Jacob is going to be tied to Laban now and forevermore. And as we've already seen in the text, there's that otherness. Jacob is splitting off. And so Jacob and Laban have a conversation about that, about how Jacob's leaving. And the text tells us that they erect stones. Jacob never offered, he never builds an altar and really offers any sacrifices. He always erects stones. For whatever reason, that's what he does. And so they erect a series of stones. That's a sign to Laban that says, when your people come out here, they can't pass these stones. If we're on the other side of these stones, we are safe from you. Now, I find very, very good marriage and premarital advice in Genesis. We talked earlier, a few weeks ago, about Rebekah, about finding a spouse. I find that in the short time that I've been on this earth and done marriage and premarital counseling, the worst marriages, first and foremost, are selfish marriages. We mentioned that with Rebekah. The worst marriages are selfish marriages. Secondly, the marriages that seem to have the most conflict, particularly in Christian environments, are marriages that don't take Genesis 2 seriously, that says that for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his spouse, and they shall become one flesh. And there are husbands and wives who refuse to leave their families. And there are families who refuse to cut the umbilical cord of their children. And that causes problems in marriage. And it causes problems here. What's the fundamental problem with Laban and Jacob? Laban doesn't want Jacob to leave. Maybe it's for selfish reasons and money and things like that, because he knows that with Jacob he can prosper. But what's Jacob doing? He's taking his two daughters, his inheritance away. So maybe it is wise. Let me say this. I'll be more firm. It is definitely wise for couples to put barriers around their marriage. It's not that you tell your parents that you can never see them again and you don't want anything to do with them. You just have to reprioritize a relationship. So barriers are very important and to come up quite often in the Bible. Okay, chapter 32, this is where we're going to end. I said we were going to get through chapter 33, but I knew that wouldn't happen. Chapter 32. The main issue in chapter 32 that everybody loses their mind over is Jacob wrestling with God. That composes a minute paragraph in the entire chapter, which means if we're reading this the way Moses wanted us to read it, We have to read that in light of everything else that is before and after it. So let's take a minute to look at what's before and after it. Jacob is headed back, and Esau now, you remember Esau, Jacob's twin brother, older by just a little bit. Esau is on his way to meet Jacob with 400 men. And that scares the ever-loving daylights out of Jacob, because Jacob did Esau very dirty, which was the reason that he had to leave. And Esau was very angry about that, and Jacob had to leave because of that. So, Jacob hears that Esau's coming with 400 men. That's all he knows. And he devises a number of schemes to hopefully protect himself and his family. One of those, I don't know if this is smart or dumb, but one of those is to divide his family into two camps. That way, if one of them's attacked, the other one can get away. I don't know. Maybe we would have done the same thing. What he does very smartly, I think, is take his servants with a number of his possessions and gives them as a gift to Esau. He sends them ahead as a gift. Now, I have been in church a long time, and so have you. I've heard this text preached and taught in Bible class, and without fail, every time I hear, well, Jacob was just trying to butter up Esau. I do not think that's what's happening. What caused Jacob and Esau to have a split in their relationship? Did Jacob not steal from Esau? Now what's he trying to do? I think he's trying to repay what he had stolen. In some sense, he can never fully repay it, but at least in some sort of repentant way, repay what he's stolen. Because the blessing would be, it would allow Esau possessions. So he sends gifts ahead. He calls Esau his Lord, lowercase L-O-R-D. In Hebrew, this is the word Adonai, which means Lord or Master, or we might say Sir, or something like that. And he calls himself a servant, which is very interesting because what did God tell Rebekah? Rebekah said, God, why am I having such trouble with my pregnancy? God says, you have 2 warring nations in your womb, and the older will serve the younger. And yet here you have the younger calling himself a servant of the older. And then, of course, he prays to God and holds God accountable to his word. Jacob basically says, God, you told me you were going to be with me. Now it's time to prove it. When you read the Psalms, that's exactly how the Psalms pray. God, you made this promise, and I'm holding you to it. And I believe that Christians need to pray like that. Hebrews chapter 10 tells us that we can boldly approach the throne of God with confidence. And I find that Christians do not pray in confidence. We pray rather timidly. So, what's the issue in chapter 32? The issue is Jacob is afraid to see the face of Esau. You do not see this in English translations, particularly in modern English translations like the NIV, the New English Translation, the New American Standard Version, the ESV, things like that. But you see it in the original language. Verse 20, for example, my Bible says, after that I will meet him. If you read that in Hebrew, it says, literally, I will see his face. You read chapter 32 in Hebrew, the word face comes up over and over and over and over and over again. Jacob is horrified to look on the face of Esau, to meet Esau. Now, come then to the pericope where he wrestles with God, so to speak. In verse, let me find the verse real quick. Verse 22. During the night, Jacob quickly took his 2 wives, 2 female servants, and 11 sons, and crossed over the ford to the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream along with all his possessions, so Jacob was left alone. Verse 24 says, then a man wrestled with him until daybreak. Nowhere in this pericope does it say point blank that it was God or an angel. Now, was it God? Well, of course it was. First of all, how do we know? Because he renames him Israel. And that's something that God does. God changes the name, right? So it's obviously God. Jacob names the place Peniel. Peniel is a Hebrew word that means face of God. And he says, I'm naming this because I have seen God face to face and lived. Okay? But he's often called the man. He's called the man every time. So who is this? Is it a man? Is it God? Is it the angel of the Lord? Your guess is as good as mine. Many times, especially in Hebrew narrative, when God or the angel of the Lord appears to humans, he appears as just a man. And so, what's the significance of Jacob wrestling with God? Well, you can look at this in a number of ways. You can look at it from a more psychological perspective. You can look at it from a biblical studies perspective. Jacob's whole existence had been him wrestling with God. And God renames Jacob, which, remember, Yaakov in Hebrew means heel, right? Because when Jacob came out of the womb, he was holding Esau's heel. And sort of colloquially means trickster, right? Because when you trick somebody, you trip them up, right? You cut them on their heel. So that's what Yaakov means. Yisrael is a play on words. Most of the time we say Yisrael means we who strive with God. That's not exactly a literal translation. A literal translation would be God fights. God fights. So what is this whole purpose? What's the whole story telling Jacob? What's Jacob afraid of? It never says he's afraid to fight with God. It says he's afraid to see the face of his brother. And this is an assurance that God is going to fight for Israel. Now, if you're a Hebrew reading this on the Exodus, about to go into Canaan, knowing that you're going to have war after war after war, what does this tell you? God fights. That's what Israel means. God fights. And then, now not to say that it doesn't also mean we who strive with God, which is also very interesting, because what is Israel's relationship to God? They strive with God. They fight with God, right? So, just to close us out here, it is okay for us to wrestle with God. I find that to be the whole essence of human existence, that we fight with God. That's what sin and righteousness do. So we fight with God. Now, when Jacob fought with God, I promise I'll let you go. I won't be like Pharaoh, and I will let God's people go. But when Jacob fought with God, God dislocated his hip. That's a very small injury, fighting with God. And maybe what has to happen in our lives when we fight with God is that God has to injure us so that we will say, God is the one who fights.